5 missiles fired at dawn, aimed at American forces in Jordan. That's how Wednesday started in the Middle East. And within hours, U.S. and Saudi warplanes were already hitting back in Iraq. 5 missiles, all intercepted, and still enough to move oil prices within the hour. That's the kind of ratio that tells you everything about where this war actually is right now. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, what it means, and the one detail most coverage is burying. Before we go further, I flew F-15E Strike Eagles in combat, and before that, I flew with the Thunderbirds. I've sat in mission planning rooms, I've read targeting packages, and I've had to make split-second calls about weapons employment under real pressure. So here's my promise to you, and I mean this. I will tell you what is confirmed, what is developing, and where there is genuine debate. Not speculation dressed up as fact, not hype for the sake of hype, just what we actually know and what we don't. So let's build the picture properly, because you can't understand Wednesday morning without understanding decades of history behind it. The United States and Iran have been locked in hostility on and off since 1979 when the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah and the subsequent U.S. Embassy hostage crisis poisoned the relationship for a generation. For over 4 decades since, you've had proxy wars fought through third parties, rolling sanctions, regimes designed to strangle Iran's economy without direct conflict, and a nuclear standoff that has repeatedly threatened to boil over. In 2015, the Obama administration helped broker the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, which traded sanctions relief for strict limits on Iran's uranium enrichment capacity, verified by international inspectors. That deal held imperfectly for 3 years. Then, in 2018, the first Trump administration withdrew the United States from the agreement entirely, reimposing sanctions and setting off a fresh spiral of tension that never really cooled. In January of 2020, that tension produced one of the most significant single moments of the pre-war era, a U.S. strike in Baghdad that killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force, the external operations arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That strike nearly triggered direct war on its own. Iran responded with ballistic missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq, and for several tense days, the entire region held its breath. It didn't escalate further that time. But every one of these moments, 1979, the JCPOA collapse, Soleimani, added another layer to a backlog of grievance that never actually got resolved. It just got postponed. What we're watching now, this year, is that whole backlog finally breaking open into direct, sustained combat between the two countries, rather than the proxy skirmishes and covert operations that defined most of the prior 4 decades. That break happened on February 28, 2026. President Trump announced what he called major combat operations against Iran, a joint U.S. Israeli campaign that opened with strikes on Iran's military leadership, its government infrastructure, and critically, a strike that took out Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, according to Britannica's running record of the conflict. Think about what that means for a moment. Khamenei wasn't just a political figure. He was the head of state, the commander-in-chief, and the final word on Iran's nuclear and military doctrine for over 3 decades, since taking the role in 1989. Removing him wasn't a tactical strike. It was decapitation of the regime's top of the pyramid, the kind of move that, historically, either collapses a government's ability to coordinate a response or triggers exactly the opposite, a furious, disorganized, but massive retaliation from whatever command structure remains. In this case, it was the latter. Iran's response was immediate and massive. Hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones launched across the region in the days and weeks that followed, according to that same Britannica timeline. This is where I want to give you some technical grounding, because the numbers matter and the hardware matters. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal is one of the largest in the Middle East, built up specifically because Iran's air force is comparatively outdated. Decades of sanctions have starved it of modern fighter jets. So Tehran invested heavily in missiles and drones instead, doctrine built around asymmetric deterrence rather than air superiority. Systems like the Shahab, Qadr, and Zulfiqar families range from medium-range liquid-fueled missiles to more mobile solid-fuel systems, some capable of reaching well over 1,000 miles, putting Israel, the Gulf states, and U.S. regional bases all within range from Iranian territory alone. You've probably seen footage from Tehran's Azadi Square, where some of these systems, the Zulfiqar and Qadr missiles specifically, have been publicly displayed on transporter erector launchers, a deliberate show of deterrent capability aimed as much at domestic morale as at foreign adversaries. It's a message. We can reach you, and we don't need an air force to do it. On the other side of the ledger, the U.S. and its regional partners rely heavily on layered air defense. Patriot batteries handle a significant share of the interception workload, a battle-tested, medium-range surface-to-air system that's been continuously upgraded since the first Gulf War. Aegis-equipped Navy destroyers add another layer offshore, using SM-3 and SM-6 interceptors capable of engaging ballistic threats at different phases of flight. In some configurations, particularly for higher altitude, longer range threats, you'll also see THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, batteries deployed. The entire concept behind layering these systems together is redundancy. You're not betting the outcome on one radar, one missile type, one system working perfectly. You want multiple intercept opportunities at different ranges and altitudes, so that if one layer misses, another gets a shot. That's exactly the kind of system that intercepted this week's missiles over Jordan, and it's why CENTCOM was able to report a clean, complete intercept rate on this particular attack. Quick ask before we go further. If you want to actually keep up with this day to day, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This conflict is moving fast, sometimes hour to hour, and I don't want you finding out 3 days late what happened this morning. Since that February opening, the war has moved in cycles, and this cyclical pattern is actually one of the most important things to understand about modern conflicts like this one. You get intense periods of strikes, sometimes nightly bombing campaigns, followed by lulls where diplomacy tries to take hold, followed by a trigger event that collapses the calm again. In June, delegations from both countries sat down for negotiations aimed at a war-ending deal, built around a signed memorandum of understanding. A framework document, not a final treaty, but a starting point for something more permanent, the kind of document that establishes shared principles before the harder work of a binding agreement even begins. That diplomatic track never fully held, though. On July 6th and 7th, Iran struck 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, and President Trump responded by declaring, in his own words, that he considered the truce over. Now, the Strait of Hormuz deserves its own explanation, because it's the single most important piece of geography in this entire conflict. And if you don't understand why, you won't understand why every skirmish here moves global markets. It's a narrow choke point between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its narrowest point, only about 21 miles wide, with the actual navigable shipping lanes even tighter than that, split into inbound and outbound channels separated by a buffer zone. Roughly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption passes through that strait every single day, along with a significant share of global liquefied natural gas exports headed to Asia and Europe. There is no viable alternative route for most of that traffic. A handful of pipelines exist that can bypass the strait, but nowhere near enough capacity to replace it. Iran has long held informal leverage over that waterway simply by proximity. Its coastline runs directly along the northern shore, and its Navy and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval forces operate fast attack craft, naval mines, and coastal anti-ship missile batteries that can threaten shipping without ever needing to win a conventional naval battle against the U.S. Fifth Fleet. That's the leverage point, and it's a smart one from a purely strategic standpoint. Iran doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy to cause massive economic damage. It just needs to make transiting that strait risky enough that shipping insurance premiums spike and companies start rerouting tankers around the Cape of Good Hope instead, adding weeks to voyages and driving costs up globally. That single dynamic is why every strike near Hormuz moves oil markets within hours, regardless of the actual military significance of the strike itself. Following the July 6th and 7th attacks, the war entered another one of its cycles. Nearly 2 weeks of relative calm, according to CNN's ongoing coverage, a stretch without the nightly bombing that had defined the war's worst periods. That calm is exactly what broke early this Wednesday morning. So let's get into the actual event breakdown, because this is where the confirmed facts matter most, according to you. Central Command, Iran launched what CENTCOM described as a surprise attack, firing ballistic missiles at American forces in the Middle East. Jordan's military said it intercepted and brought down 5 of the incoming missiles. CENTCOM's statement was specific on this point. Every missile aimed at U.S. forces was successfully intercepted, with no reported American casualties from this particular attack. That's the layered defense system doing exactly what it's designed to do. But I want to flag something here, because it's the kind of detail that gets lost in the noise. Interception is not the same as prevention. Every successful intercept still consumes an interceptor missile from a finite stockpile, still requires radar tracking and fire control computation under time pressure, still represents a resource that took months to manufacture and can't simply be replaced overnight. We'll come back to why that matters, because it's the sharpest strategic point in this whole story. Almost immediately after news of the attack broke, oil prices jumped, a direct, measurable market reaction to a single missile salvo, most of which never even reached its intended targets. That tells you how jumpy these markets are around anything touching Hormuz or U.S. forces in the Gulf region. Traders aren't pricing in what happened. They're pricing in what might happen next. The American and Allied response came within hours. U.S. and Saudi Arabian forces conducted joint strikes in Iraq, targeting what CENTCOM described as Iran-aligned militia groups, proxy forces that have operated in Iraq for years, often under loose umbrella organizations aligned with Tehran's regional strategy, sometimes referred to collectively in Western reporting as Iran-backed militias, or the broader axis of resistance network that also includes Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. Fox News flagged something important here. This marks the first time Saudi Arabia has joined the United States in direct strikes during this specific war. That's not a small detail, and I want to sit on it for a second, because Saudi Arabia has spent essentially the entire conflict trying to avoid exactly this kind of direct military entanglement. Riyadh shares a long, tense, and complicated relationship with Iran, decades of proxy competition across Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, briefly interrupted by a Chinese-brokered normalization deal back in 2023 that restored diplomatic relations after years of estrangement following the 2016 severing of ties. Saudi Arabia has enormous exposure to any wider regional war, both economically, given its own oil infrastructure, sits well within range of Iranian missile systems, and politically, given the delicate balancing act the kingdom has tried to maintain between its Western security partnerships and its cautious post-2023 thaw with Tehran. For Riyadh to join a direct strike operation, even a narrowly targeted one against militias rather than Iran itself, signals either a significant shift in Saudi threat perception or significant pressure from Washington, or quite possibly both at once. Iraq's government, for its part, condemned the joint U.S.-Saudi strike as a violation of its sovereignty. Iraq has occupied an extremely difficult position throughout this entire war. Its territory hosts both American military installations, dating back to the post-2014 campaign against ISIS, and Iran-aligned militia groups, sometimes within the same province or even the same city. Baghdad has repeatedly rejected the idea that its territory should be used as a launchpad for strikes against Iran, a stance that reflects the genuine bind the Iraqi government is in, too closely aligned with Washington, and it risks destabilizing internal politics shaped by powerful pro-Iran factions within its own parliament, too permissive toward Iranian proxies, and it risks losing American security cooperation, military support, and economic investment that Iraq badly needs. Layer on top of all that the diplomatic activity happening simultaneously in Washington. President Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, their first face-to-face meeting since the war began back in February, according to CNN's coverage. That timing is not incidental. A wartime meeting between the two leaders most responsible for launching this campaign, happening on the exact day Iran broke the recent calm with a missile attack. And in the middle of all of this, Fox News is reporting that President Trump is weighing what's being described as a decapitation strike against IRGC leadership. I want to be careful with this one because it's reported as something under consideration, not something confirmed as executed. But if it happens, it would represent one of the most significant escalations of the entire war, targeting not just Iran's conventional military infrastructure, but the command structure of the IRGC itself, the ideologically driven parallel military that operates alongside and often above Iran's regular armed forces, and which controls much of Iran's missile program, its Quds Force expeditionary operations, and its extensive business and economic holdings. Now here's the strategic layer, and this is genuinely the part I think most coverage misses. Iran's operational pattern here looks like classic asymmetric pressure. Missile harassment that probably won't penetrate layered defenses, proxy strikes routed through militias in Iraq rather than direct Iranian state action, and a standing threat against shipping in Hormuz. None of these, individually, are likely to defeat the United States militarily, and Iran's leadership almost certainly knows that. But that's not actually the goal. The goal is cost imposition, raising the price of continued American and Allied involvement, stretching interceptor stockpiles thin, keeping oil markets nervous and volatile, and forcing Washington to constantly divert attention, personnel, and resources toward defending against low-probability, high-disruption attacks. It's a strategy built around exhaustion rather than victory in the conventional sense. The same logic that shaped Iranian doctrine for decades, given the imbalance in conventional air power between Tehran and Washington. The American and Saudi response tells a different strategic story. Pulling Saudi Arabia into direct combat operations for the first time in this war is a meaningful signal. It suggests Washington is trying to build out a broader regional coalition, rather than carrying the operational burden alone. A wider coalition matters for two reasons. First, it distributes the military and financial cost of sustained operations across more shoulders. Second, and maybe more importantly, it makes any future ceasefire or settlement more durable, because more regional stakeholders have skin in the outcome and a reason to enforce it going forward. Unilateral American action can be reversed by the next administration or dismissed by Tehran as one country's grievance rather than a regional consensus. A coalition outcome, with Gulf Arab states directly invested, is much harder to walk back. But here's the tension underneath all of it, and I think this is genuinely the sharpest point in this whole analysis. Reporting from the Associated Press notes that repeated rounds of fighting are drawing down key U.S. air defense stockpiles. Interceptors, the missiles that actually shoot down incoming threats, are expensive, slow to manufacture, and finite. A single Patriot interceptor can cost several $1,000,000, and production lines can't simply be scaled up overnight to match wartime consumption rates. Every successful intercept, every single one, consumes a resource that can't be instantly replaced. If Iran's strategy is genuinely built around repeated, sustained missile harassment, even attacks with a near zero success rate at actually hitting targets, then Iran doesn't need to win an engagement. It just needs to keep firing often enough, for long enough, that American and allied interceptor stockpiles run thinner than the world currently assumes, and thinner than public statements have let on. That's not a hypothetical. That's a live question raised directly by current reporting, and it's the kind of vulnerability that doesn't show up in a single day's headlines, but compounds quietly, week over week, month over month, until it becomes the actual deciding factor in how long this war can be sustained. Now let's talk about the human and economic cost, because behind every one of these strategic calculations are real people absorbing the consequences. Inside Iran, the war has collided directly with a genuine domestic energy crisis. Iran's Chamber of Commerce Energy Commission reports the country's daily gas shortfall has climbed to somewhere between 300 and 450 million cubic meters a day. Iran is also facing an electricity shortfall of more than 15,000 megawatts, according to Iranian state-linked reporting. To put that in perspective, that's a shortfall large enough that Iran's own energy ministry has asked citizens to cut back on air conditioning used just to stabilize supply to parts of the country, particularly in the south. And this is happening while temperatures in southern Iran have recently soared above 50 degrees Celsius. That's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine that combination for a moment. Extreme heat, a collapsing energy grid, and a government simultaneously trying to fight a multi-front war against the world's most powerful military and its regional allies. Officials have floated the idea of cutting gas supplies to villages entirely and instead trucking in liquid fuel and equipment to help residents survive the coming winter. That's not military strategy. That's a population absorbing the cost of a war their government chose to escalate, regardless of how justified Tehran believes its retaliation to be. And globally, every time Iran fires on shipping lanes or Kiruiru, forces near the Gulf, you see it in oil prices within hours, sometimes within minutes of the first headline. That's not an abstract economic data point. That's the price of gasoline at a station near you, the cost of shipping goods across oceans, the input cost baked into nearly everything that gets manufactured or transported using oil-based energy. A war fought in the Strait of Hormuz doesn't stay contained in the Strait of Hormuz. It moves through global supply chains and shows up weeks later on receipts and bills thousands of miles from any actual missile in countries that have no direct stake in this conflict at all. So here's what I want to know from you, because these are the real open questions, not just rhetorical ones. First, does Saudi Arabia joining U.S. strikes mark a genuine turning point toward a broader regional coalition, or is this a one-off response tied narrowly to this specific attack, after which Riyadh pulls back toward its earlier posture of restraint? Second, if a decapitation strike on IRGC leadership actually happens, does it shorten this war by removing a key command structure, or does it guarantee years of decentralized, insurgent-style retaliation from an organization that has historically operated through exactly that kind of distributed, redundant network? And third, with U.S. interceptor stockpiles reportedly thinning after repeated engagements, is the real vulnerability here not any single missile salvo, but the slow attrition of America's defensive capacity over months of sustained low-intensity attacks? Drop your take in the comments below. And if this breakdown actually helped you understand what's happening, do me a favor and hit share. A lot of people are trying to make sense of this conflict right now, and clear, sourced analysis is hard to find in the middle of a fast-moving story like this one. Let's bring it all together and recap what's actually confirmed. Iran fired missiles at U.S. forces in Jordan early Wednesday morning, and every missile aimed at American forces was intercepted, according to CENTCOM. The United States and Saudi Arabia carried out joint retaliatory strikes against Iran-aligned militias in Iraq, the first time Saudi forces have joined direct U.S. strikes in this war. Iraq's government condemned that joint strike as a violation of its sovereignty. President Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House, and separate reporting indicates Trump is weighing a strike targeting IRGC leadership. Oil prices rose in direct response to the attack. And inside Iran, a serious and worsening energy crisis is compounding the pressure of the war itself, even as extreme heat grips the southern part of the country. This war is still moving, the diplomacy is still fragile, and the strategic picture is still shifting week to week. Stay with me. We'll keep tracking every confirmed development as it happens.